So hi everybody, welcome to the 2016 research update session and question and answer panel session. I'm Jill Jarecki and I'm the research director for Cure SMA. And today we're going to talk about multiple things during this session. The first, I'm going to start off with a talk just talking about the evolving research strategy at Cure SMA. And then we'll have a talk from Annie Kennedy, Vice President of Public Policy at PPMD, on the new drug application process, and give some case studies and examples from what's happened in the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community. We'll then have a panel discussion about what we've learned about the new drug application process, or NDA process. And then finally, we'll close out the session with a Q&A panel on with representatives from all the drug companies that have programs in clinical development. Since we have a tight program, I'm going to flow right into my presentation. And so at Cure SMA, we've funded research since our inception more than 30 years ago. And to date, we funded about $60 million in new research funding, thanks to all your hard work to help us generate that money to fund these important research projects. And we've traditionally funded our research in 5 different areas: basic research to understand the basic biology of the disease, drug discovery to turn these ideas into real therapies, clinical research to have the tools to do this, and then care research to make an impact on the quality of lives in the near term of patients with SMA. And of course, the SMA Researcher Meeting. This year is the 20th year of the SMA Researcher Meeting, and we had a record number of attendees, about 325 researchers there to share their progress over 3 days and hopefully form partnerships and collaborations to advance research forward. The way we fund research has always been based on having our scientific advisors give us independent advice to try to prioritize these projects and pick the best ones for us to fund. And we thank our SAB, TAC, and MAC for helping us do that. And please look at our website to learn more about the people that help us with our research programs. As you've heard throughout this conference, we've made a lot of progress in SMA research over the last 10 to 15 years. And so in late fall of 2015, we started an exercise at Cure SMA to really think about whether we need to update our research strategy for the evolving place we are in the SMA research space. So in order to do that, what we did was we developed a survey and we gave it out to leading experts in the field. And from that survey, we came up with opportunities and threats and a list of comprehensive research projects that we could consider funding. And through the Science and Medicine Committee on our board of directors, we prioritized that list for Cure SMA funding using several different metrics. These metrics included importance to our mission, feasibility for Cure SMA to carry out, and most importantly, the unique ability for Cure SMA to carry out. And from that, three main priorities were identified. So the first main priority was, the first of these priorities was continued funding for basic research. To continue to try to determine what, where, and when the SMN protein is needed. There's still a lot to learn about that. One of the big things that came out of where we should focus our basic research funding was the identification of novel drug targets beyond SMN. So why is that important? That's important so we can make combination therapies and hopefully have the ability to most effectively treat all stages and types of SMA. This may take a cocktail approach, and so it's important for us to start thinking about how to do that now. The second priority was greater funding for clinical and regulatory research. As you heard, we have 6 programs in clinical development right now. So how can we make that process more efficient? There were several things within that priority identified. So regulatory approaches to patient-focused drug development. How do we add the patient voice to this by defining clinically meaningfulness and determining risk-benefit framework? And then hopefully to have a voice of the patient meeting with the FDA to present these type of findings. Developing centers of excellence for clinical trials, so there are more clinical trial sites across the US and they're better trained. And then engaging and education of physician, caregivers, and patients on clinical trials with an early emphasis perhaps on educating physicians and growing awareness about SMA to reduce the time of diagnosis. And then the third priority is one led by Dr. Mary Schroth, and you've heard a lot about this, I think, yesterday, with a greater emphasis and investment in patient care funding to improve the quality of life for patients in the near term, including a patient care database and centers of excellence. So we'll fully implement this new strategic plan and research in our new fiscal year that starts on July 1st, but we began to do that with the funding in our current fiscal year that goes through June 30th. And we funded $2 million in research in this current fiscal year. We have 26 active projects, both new and ongoing. This includes 8 new basic research projects and 4 new drug discovery projects. And the bulk of the funding for new drug discovery projects was put to this area of combination therapies and trying to find alternative targets that could act in combination with SMN enhancers that are currently in clinical trials. The three new clinical and regulatory projects which fall under those priorities I just discussed with you, and a newly formed industry consortium that I think Kenneth mentioned yesterday, and I'll talk about again towards the end of my talk. 2 new clinical care projects, and then, of course, the SMA researcher meeting I just discussed with you. So one of our goals for our research funding has been and will continue to be leverage. We view our money as seed money that we hope will generate preliminary data to de-risk these programs and help encourage or generate bigger pots of money from either industry or government. And that's one of our ongoing goals at Cure SMA. And as a community, we've been quite successful at this. As you see on this graph, as the number of SMA programs have grown, so have the number of companies actively spending money in these areas. And I just list several notable examples from Cure SMA funding where we've been successful with this, with antisense, gene therapy, with cytokinetics, and with a Caliber program, California Institute of Biomedical Research in San Diego. You've seen this drug pipeline slide throughout the course of the conference. I don't think I have a pointer up here, but I'm going to talk about it maybe in a slightly different context than other people have talked about it, and sort of point out where we're interested in putting our research money today and why. So most of the drug programs on the pipeline are drugs that are focused on increasing SMN levels for obvious reasons. That treats the underlying cause of the disease. But as I said, we want to have an emphasis on combination therapies. So a lot of the drugs that we're investing in and our emphasis will be on these very early stage at the bottom of the pipeline and trying to develop new drug programs or identify new targets through basic research that can become drug programs that are that are focused. So down here, I'm focused on new drug targets to use in combination with the SMN approaches that sort of fill up the bulk of this drug pipeline slide. And then the other place where we're going to invest a lot of money, our efforts, are over here in the clinical development space to try to, as I said, provide the patient voice there and to make that go more efficiently. And so I wanted to just spend a couple more slides talking about how we plan to do that and what we have been doing to sort of enable clinical development and move drugs through the pipeline more quickly. One of the things that we've done for the last couple of years is fund new clinical trial outcomes. An example of this would be to Dr. Lowe's at Nationwide Children's Hospital, who's trying to develop a new infant outcome using the Connect system, or another example would be to Dr. Heatwald at the University of Rochester to have a new adult patient outcome measure. And the goal of both of these would be to allow a broader number of patients to go into clinical trials. Another thing we've been actively working on for the past several years is to provide the patient perspective to the FDA so they understand the needs of our community and what they would want to see in a drug. Just some examples of this are listed here. So the first one is in conjunction with Biogen and also one of our other partners, the SMA Foundation, we did family-friendly focus groups throughout 2014 and 15. And I think interviewed over 120 people. And the goal of that was to learn more about clinical meaningfulness, what patients would want a drug to do for them in their everyday lives, and to also what the impact of having SMA is on your everyday life. From those 2 focus groups, we have 2 resulting papers, and both of those papers have been or will be sent to the FDA. We've also done patient surveys on what patients believe or think about clinical trials or want from clinical trials. And one of our big projects that we've done was this Voices booklet, which you can see up here in the corner, where we collected stories from all of you in the patient community and organized them from the themes we found from these focus groups and produced this booklet, which we sent to the FDA. And we know that people at the highest level of the FDA looked at it because we got a really gracious letter back from Janet Woodcock telling us what an impact that made on her. And of course, Janet Woodcock is the head of CDER at the FDA. What else have we done? So we've had a number of patient meetings with the FDA and trying to bring patients to talk to the FDA both by phone and in person about what they want from SMA drug development. And of course, we do more formal things like comment on FDA guidances and other activities like that. And I think you all received an envelope during registration that gave a lot of details and examples about all of these different projects that we've done. So at your leisure, please take a look at that and find out more about these different projects. So over the next year, we're going to focus a lot more of our funding and efforts in this area. And our next step is really to formalize these activities with an industry consortium that we've been working to form for the last 6 months. And so we've been really actively working to bring the companies together to work on projects of mutual interest, to share data, to share ideas, to focus on patient-focused drug development projects where we can bring the patient view to the FDA. And we had our kickoff meeting last Wednesday, just a couple of days ago, and we're really excited to carry that on as a big focus for the organization over the next year. And the type of projects that we want to work on are to have a voice of the patient workshop with the FDA, to further define clinical meaningfulness, and in fact, Kenneth talked about picking up this flyer, which is a project that Roche is leading, but has been been working with all the other companies in this consortium to get feedback on this. And it's a study of where interview process that will be occurring both in the US and the UK to try to furtherly define clinical meaningfulness. So take a look at this because it really will help further drug development and help the FDA and drug developers and regulators in Europe and across the world understand what SMA is and what patients want from drugs. As I told you, look at risk-benefit, centers of excellence for clinical trials, and education of physicians and caregivers. So next fiscal year, we'll fully implement this new strategic plan and research, and we're going to have 3 major goals for this plan: identifying new drug targets, as I told you, facilitating clinical and regulatory approaches through this new consortium, and the patient care initiatives that Dr. Schroth will be taking out. So thanks to all of you and your hard work, we'll be able to invest another $2.5 million across these research areas. So through those last couple of slides, I hope I've given you a flavor of how we're thinking about research at Cure SMA and how it's evolving as we progress and how the landscape changes. Because it's really important for us to make sure that we're thinking about the current SMA landscape and make sure we're changing and evolving and doing the right, funding the right research as we go forward. So I'm just going to spend the last couple of slides setting up the panel discussion and talk that we're going to have next. And so the focus of the next part of this session is going to be on the new drug development process. And that is what happens after phase 3 or registration trials ends. What comes next? And you've all seen this slide, I think, many times, and you've heard about the different phases of clinical trials. But what happens down here when the clinical trials end and it says the approval process and says 2 years? I mean, what the heck could take 2 years after you're done with clinical trials? There are different things that can happen to speed up this process, but are there things that can happen to speed up this process? And one of them is priority review, and drugs that have orphan designation will go through priority review. So I just wanted to quickly, to set up the next part of this, talk about the new drug application process. And once the trials end, there is a process where the sponsor or the drug company will work to put together a package called a new drug application package. It's extensive and basically will contain virtually every piece of information they've ever gathered on that drug. It'll probably be, tens of thousands of pages long, and this could take several months to prepare. And then once they submit it for a typical drug, the whole process would probably take about 12 months. For an expedited review process, a priority review like you would have for an orphan drug, it would typically take 8 to 9 months for that process to occur, and there would be a number of different steps in that process. And one of the most notable would be an advisory committee meeting, where the FDA would convene a lot of outside advisors, share the data with them, and ask them their opinion on whether the drug was approvable or not. So it's a long, and Annie Kennedy will talk a little bit more about all of these steps and what they've learned in the DMD community about how this process can go in different timelines, different results, and different expectations about the pathway, the different types of pathways that can go through this new drug application process. And then finally, I just wanted to say that not every drug that completes a phase 3 trial will actually file an NDA. About 60% of them do. The other 40%, the sponsor and the FDA decide together probably that it's not wise to submit an NDA. And then once the NDA is submitted, about 90% of them are approved, but 1 out of 10 are not approved. The FDA decides that the drug has not met the burden of proof, the criteria for them to approve the drug and allow the sponsor to start marketing that drug. So I think I now invite Annie Kennedy, who is the Vice President of Legislation and Public Policy at Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, and she's going to talk to us and give us some case studies about different examples of results that have happened in the NDA process in her community. So thank you, Annie.
All right, so while we're looking for my slides, thank you, Jill. That was a great intro, and I'm thank you, Jill. And I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. So what Jill asked me to talk about was to talk about the NDA through the lens of our patient community, the Duchenne community, and just another sister rare disease community. But I also want to talk about what we as a patient community can do to help impact that process, because I think that's really important for us to talk. I should also say that I serve on the board of Cure SMA, and I've been involved in the SMA community for about 25 years. So what we as a community can do to help impact that process so that it's not a matter of just sitting and waiting and watching, and what some of the terms that you're going to hear mean. And then the other thing is to help set up what the panels are going to talk about this afternoon. And then for us, at the end of the day, it's all about access, right? We all want access to these drugs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Cure SMA, what PPMD, the organization I work for, are doing now, pre-approval, to help hasten the access on the back end. So just get into it. So first of all, why are we here? We are a part of an ecosystem, which include, and I will make these slides available also, so you don't have to take pictures of them, we'll push them out, and there's a lot more information in these slides that I'm going to talk about so that we can make it available to you. But we're part of a very broad ecosystem, and what I love about this conference is all of the stakeholders are here together. So we have academia, we have industry, we have clinicians, but at the center of this ecosystem is us, the patient community. And one of our challenges is that as we're going through these clinical trials, to make sure that we are taking what we are learning within these clinical trials and within the lived experience of the disease and plugging it right back into the clinical trial process. So for example, in the Duchenne community, as individuals are enrolling in clinical trials, we've been learning that some families are being forced to make really hard decisions. The standard of care in Duchenne, muscular dystrophy, is steroids. Do I choose to put my child on steroids or not? Because that may or may not preclude him from participating in a clinical trial. So are we withholding standards of care in our diseases because the treatment pipeline, which, let's be honest, clinical trials feel like treatments, the clinical trial pipeline is becoming so robust. So rather than withholding care, should we not be going back and looking at how to redesign clinical trials sooner, so that that interaction with industry in this ecosystem has to be so quick and robust? And that's what happens at this meeting. That's what happens within Cure SMA. These conversations are happening in a very dynamic way. But that is the responsibility of the patient community to be making sure that you're having these conversations with your providers so that all of these conversations can be happening all the time. So here, I'm sorry this is blurry, but this is the therapeutic development pipeline. We all know these stats. It takes 15 years, about $1 billion per product. Each patient, maybe in a lifetime, gets one shot on goal to participate in a clinical trial. We can't afford to fail. And these aren't great odds. So what can we do to make sure that the trials, that this really robust pipeline we see in SMA of the drugs that are going into phase 2, phase 3, are successful? How can we inform the clinical trial design and these applications that are going to the FDA to make sure that they yield approvals and not rejections? So the other thing is that all of the stakeholders in our ecosystem have a shared goal. And I think that's really important that we recognize that. So that the clinicians who are here have invested decades of their lives to improving the lives and saving the lives of children with SMA. But of course, nobody wants a therapy more than you, than the family sitting here, right? But everybody has a shared goal. But being a rare disease community does have really unique challenges, right? We're small communities. The incentives for industry are very different. And so as a community, we've had to help develop new incentives to bring industry in. It used to be, in the rare disease community, we didn't have a lot of industry in our space. And it's a very different world now. And the reason for that is because we have created new incentives that I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to go through them individually, but I am going to talk about how the landscape has changed. But the first issue is that the imperative is that to fulfill unmet needs, we have to accelerate treatment discovery for patients with progressive, debilitating, life-threatening diseases, for which no approved treatments are currently available, right? That's the imperative. And we will accept any incremental benefit when it meets that benefit-risk ratio, right? I think anyone in this room would accept any incremental benefit. But here's the dilemma. FDA's mandate is to protect public safety as well as to facilitate the development of new treatments. But they have to do that within well-defined laws and regulations. So the challenge, or we like to frame it as an opportunity, is to develop approaches that are creative within regulatory boundaries, or to change guidances in collaboration with the FDA, or to change and create legislation and regulations. And so that's what's happened. So we have to consider alternative concepts in rare disease regulatory decision-making. Otherwise, the message that we're sending to our patient communities is these products aren't for you, they're for the next generation. So let's talk about what's been happening. So you've probably heard about the Orphan Drug Act. which is what's authorized a lot of what Jill just talked about. I'm sure you've heard a lot about 21st century cures. We've been pushing out a lot of information about that. PPMD wrote guidance. All of these efforts have been regulatory legislative policy efforts to reshape this landscape, to write new laws, to give the FDA regulatory cover to be able to do the things that we as rare disease communities are asking for, and to incentivize industry and allow industry to come into this space in a very robust way. So we basically took that ecosystem that I showed you, worked together and said, let's reshape the way this ecosystem works together. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. Again, this is for you to take the slides back. But I do want to just clarify one term. And if you've been following what's happening in the Duchenne space, we talk a lot about, we have been really pushing the FDA to apply regulatory flexibility, apply the tools of FDASIA, which FDASIA is the FDA Safety Innovation Act, which is one of the laws that's been very important to our communities. But regulatory flexibility means reliance on a single, adequate, and well-controlled style or study with confirmatory evidence, meaning that they can approve a product after one trial, not having to repeat that trial again. So that doesn't mean, well, if you don't feel like the data is really robust, look the other way. It doesn't mean lower the rigor with which you apply. It doesn't mean we want anything to be less safe for our families. It means only require one trial for this rare disease community because you recognize that the need is so great. I've also listed here, just for your reference, the legislation that authorized some of what Jill just talked about. But what I think is the visual I really like here, and this is the visual came from my friends at NORD, is to show you where all of these different pieces of legislation fit on the drug development pipeline. So how these different pieces of legislation help speed this pathway for industry. So again, these were patient communities, rare disease communities coming in, working with industry and saying, where are the roadblocks? How can we help you work through them? And let's figure out how to move through them and knock down these barriers together. So Jill did ask me to talk about US versus EU, and we can talk about it a little more in the panel. The only thing I'm gonna spend much time on here right now is that there is one early access incentive in the EU that does not exist here in the US that I want to bring out, and it's called conditional marketing authorization. And what happens with conditional marketing authorization in the EU, which we do not, again, have here in the US, and I would like for us to have here in the US, but that's PPMD's bias. I'm not going to put that on Cure SMA's policy agenda yet, is that that medicines can, in certain categories, can be approved on the basis of surrogate markers when they don't have all their complete data. And the benefit risk balance of the product has to be established and weigh in favor of benefit, not risk. But what it does is it means that there's a conditional approval for 1 year that has to be then reviewed annually. And that benefit risk equation has to not shift annually. But the one thing that has made that difficult in Europe that we have to watch is it has shifted the burden of evidence collection to post-market, that phase 4 review. And that is becoming a hindrance for access, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So if you don't collect all the data you need beforehand, after approval, there's a whole process that goes on in order for us to get access to the product. And so if you don't have enough data, it can slow access for families in Europe. But that you will hear about conditional marketing authorization. I'm going to talk in a moment about a product in Duchenne where it was granted marketing authorization in 2014, has not yet been approved in the US. So I'm just going to talk really quickly about Duchenne. I can answer questions privately about it later. I'm here at the meeting through the end of the meeting. But I'm on your SMA threads. I see a lot of conversation about it. I know people are watching. So I just want to talk a little bit about Duchenne. The first thing is Duchenne, there's a lot happening in our pipeline. And we've had a lot of cooperation from the FDA, and it's not just because we have a really powerful community that convenes, which is incredibly important, and it's not just because we've had AdComs where we've had 500 and 1,000 people come, which was incredibly important, but it's because we've really done a lot of hard work to create what's called patient-focused drug development, or the science of patient input. We have a very plugged-in, savvy, articulate community that has engaged at really important time points. And that has been very important. And the FDA regards us as a partner and a trusted source of information. And that's been really critical. So this is what our pipeline looks like. It's a lot like the one you just saw. And so the takeaway there is that in Duchenne trials are really hard too. So we have more than 40 companies. We have a lot of different targets for treatment and multisystemic disorder. The average life expectancy for Duchenne still isn't much more than 20, and we have young boys who unfortunately die much earlier than that. And we have very narrow windows for inclusion in our trials, and we need to push out the inclusion criteria for trials. And with the trials, right now on clinicaltrials.gov, and our conference is next week, so I just did this, we actively need to recruit 2,300 patients for clinical trials to fill the trials right now. And with that narrow inclusion criteria, even the current trials would just be filled if everybody we know of eligible would fill them. So what PPMD did is we have really built a very robust infrastructure with which we can engage industry and bring industry in, but then we can also engage regulators. And again, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but it includes patient registries, it includes newborn screening programs, it includes protocol design for and information for industry. We have done a lot of the work that Jill has talked about around qualitative and quantitative patient preference assessment. And I'm just going to we have care standards in Duchenne, and we also have certified clinics so that we can make sure that care is being coordinated in very robust but also uniform ways across the country. But I'm going to highlight a few things on here. So the first is that when FDASIA was reauthorized in 2012, there was something called PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. And patient-focused drug development was really the centerpiece of that. And PPMD really embraced the implementation of PDUFA. And we, coming out of that, issued a white paper and looked at PDUFA through the lens of our Duchenne community, and issued some very impactful statements about things that we wanted for Duchenne, but really they're applicable for SMA also. So we wanted the potential to speed responsible access to new therapies. We wanted to expand the use of accelerated approval for our therapies. We wanted the FDA to issue clear guidance outlining the level of evidence required for the use of surrogate endpoints. We wanted to pilot the use of adaptive approval, and we wanted the FDA to give greater weight to demonstrated benefit-risk patients' preferences as well as caregivers. And then we went and met with the FDA about this white paper and about the preferences of our patient community. And the FDA was very interested in hearing more. We also had a guidance for industry that had been done by the EMA around the same time. We asked the FDA if they would do guidance for Duchenne in the US, and they said no. They said they can't do guidance for every rare disease, but if we wanted to do guidance, they would consider accepting it. So we held a policy forum, and we wrote guidance for industry. And this is a little bit about that guidance. We also conducted quantitative benefit-risk studies. So what the FDA said to us was, we really appreciate hearing from patients, we like meeting with families, but FDA speaks in terms of data, and we need real data so that we can review this data when we look at a package, a submission from around a product from a sponsor, and hear what the patients want with regard to that product through data. So we've now done 2 patient preference studies, and we're now doing our 3rd. Okay. We also have a consortium, I'm not going to go into any detail, but similar to what you guys are now launching. And as I said, we have a global registry and a genetic identification program. I'm just very quickly going to highlight a couple things, but I want to move into access, and my time is going. So we've had a lot of activity in the last quarter and a half. The first is PTC Therapeutics. I had said we have a company that was granted conditional approval in August of 2014. which means that patients in Europe, in some countries, have access. So that it currently has a global footprint in 23 countries and commercial access in 46 countries. So we were very excited about the path forward with the FDA. The company's been working closely with the FDA. And then in February, PTC received what was called an RTF, to which our community said, WTF. We didn't know what that meant. And that is, what it stands for, is a refusal to file. So this company and this community that has access outside the US means that the FDA, when the company came in, submitted everything to the FDA looked at all the paperwork, went through it all, and won't file it. So just to go through the terminology, it's as if when you submit your application for college, the college then has to file it and say, okay, we're now going to review it. The FDA is not even going to review the product because of things that are being worked out now between the company and the FDA, but that is 11 years of clinical trial experience from the patient community. So the company and the FDA are now working on what the regulatory path forward is, but we have patients who have been in that trial for 11 years, believe that they've seen benefit, and we have patients with Duchenne outside the US who have access to that product. But the other thing is, remember, that product has conditional approval outside the US, which gets reviewed annually. So a negative path forward, a negative decision by the FDA could impact whether or not that approval is granted when it comes up for reauthorization and review outside the US. BioMarin drisapersen, this was, again, highly watched here in the US. This is an exon skipping therapy. This was, again, really passionate, important moment for our community. It was the first time we had an advisory committee meeting. When the briefing documents for this came out, our community learned, so many patients who'd been in this trial, it was a very large trial, about 300 patients, some patients had side effects. And some of the side effects were skin reactions, some were subcutaneous. But when the briefing documents came out, the community learned the side effects may have been more than some of the community realized. And the community in Europe had been exposed for longer durations with less interruption than the community in the US. This was a moment where we learned how safety and really taking the time to learn about clinical trials really matters. Now, we had an AdCom. Patients came forward and talked about what that benefit risk scenario looks like. If you're seeing incremental improvement and slowing a progression of disease, what trade-off will you be willing to accept? What side effects would you be willing to tolerate? But there were patients who had been on that drug who had withdrawn and said, we will not tolerate those side effects, we won't take it. Some who came forward and said, it would be okay with us, but it was a moment for our community. Ultimately, the FDA said no. The company still pursued approval in Europe, and then just a couple weeks ago withdrew their application in Europe because they were pretty sure they wouldn't have a favorable review. I'm just going to skip ahead to, we have some very positive things happening right now. We have Synthera had just filed for marketing authorization. This is a pulmonary product, which we're excited about. Marathon is another one. We have a steroid alternative, or it's a steroid that only has access outside the US that we're hoping will have access inside the US. And then we have Sarepta, and a lot of people have been following the Sarepta story. We are cautiously optimistic that in the Sarepta story, this is one where the goalposts keep moving. But we're very cautiously optimistic that the last thing that the FDA has asked for is going to yield, hopefully, a positive outcome and maybe the first approval in the US. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is just the process through the lens of the patient community of what happens once a company submits an NDA to the FDA and what those clocks look like. So I'll keep it up there a second for people taking pictures, and then I'll move on. Okay, Jill did ask me to talk about advisory committee meetings. Really what I'm just going to say about advisory committee meetings is they do not always happen. They happen at the discretion of the director of CDER when a new molecular entity has been submitted for review, and when they feel that there are unanswered questions, or when they want to hear from other outside experts, or perhaps the patient community. We have found that we've now had two. We have found them to be incredibly important. They allow for additional experts, additional clinicians, researchers, some of the PIs of the trial, and the patient community to come in and talk about what their experience on the product has been. In Sarepta's AdCom, it allowed for us to bring in the patients who had been on the additional studies. So not the sponsor can only talk about the study under review, but there had been other studies and other patients who had now had exposure to the product, and we as a community brought them all forward, and you were allowed then to bring that before the advisory committee and talk about that experience. Okay, I will say the PDUFA date, we all hear about the PDUFA date. The PDUFA date is the date by which we hope the FDA has made a decision about a product, but it turns out, and we've now had 2 products go through review and 2 products that missed that PDUFA date, the FDA only has to try and meet that mark in 90% of their reviews. So we're 2 for 2 outside of that. We actually view that as hopefully a good thing, which means we're now applying a lot of new innovative tools, and the FDA is taking their time to really hear from us and work through the process. I have a slide here about what the different AdCom scenarios are. So after an AdCom, the decision of an advisory committee is a recommendation to the FDA. So if at an advisory committee meeting, the vote seems negative, that does not mean the answer is no. It just means that the FDA then takes that back and talks about it. And we've been told many times that it is the discussion of the advisory committee members that matters more to them than the vote. So I'm just going to end on access because that is what matters most. So this is the cure to care continuum. And we are at that purple star. And coverage happens over here at this pink star. So we have a ways to go before you have access to a product. And even FDA approval is here at the top. FDA approval, the day that an announcement is made that a product has been approved, and I'm sure there will be celebrations across the land, especially in our Duchenne community. There's still a lot of work to be done, and probably several months before people have access to that product. So what happens? Well, there are discussions about labeling, who's on the label, which means who can be prescribed that product. There are discussions with about the formularies with medical providers, so we're just going to talk about that. Questions about will the label be broad enough? So will the label only reflect that those who were in the trial, so those who met the inclusion criteria for the trial will have access, or will it be broad enough to be applied to the general community who might benefit? And so what I did here is I pulled, and so the closest thing we have for the Duchenne community on thinking on this is, as I told you, PPMD wrote guidance for Duchenne, and then the FDA responded by writing guidance for Duchenne. This is from the FDA's guidance on Duchenne, which we believe would probably have a lot of applicability to SMA. And it says, data from even a relatively small number of patients across different disease subgroups may help to support an indication that includes broader groups of patients. So we consider that to be hopeful. But until we see what happens, we won't know how FDA actually, how this plays out. We know that industry comes in applying for the broadest labels possible, and the more evidence there is, the more safety data there is, the more additional arms of a study there have been, the better this plays out for us. Okay, so then what happens next after an approval? Well, there is an entire process between a drug company, there's a group called the PBM, the Pharmacy Benefit Managers, so there are negotiations that go on around how much, what the formularies, what the pricing will look like. And then there are pharmacy and therapeutics companies within health plans that prioritize based on the drug safety, their determination of efficacy, and cost. So there are a lot of negotiations that happen that we won't see, that we won't be a part of. And then there are differences between commercial health insurers and Medicaid. So with commercial health insurers, this is all pretty centralized, but with Medicaid, these are state-by-state discussions. These have to be had with each state, and states have their own advisory boards that make these determinations. So if you are a Medicaid recipient, which in this community, we have a lot of, our families are Medicaid eligible through the waivers, there are some states, like Texas is one, where there's often a delay because of their legislative budget board versus other states often are faster. So QRSMA has been working to try and avoid those delays as much as possible. Okay, so these are just factors that are way into this. I'm just going to skip through some of this. And then I've included a list of questions, and hopefully QRSMA will share this, that you can be asking now. You can be looking at your policies to be proactive. Because we don't know when, but we do know that there will be therapies for SMA. And we do know they will be expensive. These are rare diseases. These are taking a long time. This is personalized medicine. It's best description of personalized medicine. And so there are some questions you can be asking of your policy and looking at your coverage now so that you can be as prepared as possible. And we can look at the hepatitis C community and the CF community and learn a lot from those communities and know that access isn't always easy, and we can be prepared. With CF, we saw with Medicaid, some Medicaid plans wouldn't cover the CF because they wanted to see more progression of the disease before they would cover it. With hepatitis, what we heard was the payers weren't prepared for the cost, and they didn't know it was coming. And so we're learning a lot, and we as the regulatory folks in our communities are working through those issues. So I'll just leave you with the thought that the only thing worse than not having a therapy would be having a therapy that we can't access. So QRSMA is working hard to make sure that doesn't happen. And this is a list of items that QRSMA has been working on for some time to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it includes engaging with FDA, engaging with CMS, working with state Medicaid programs already, proactively, convening the industry consortia, establishing health economic models. You can imagine that while some of the therapies we may be talking about might be blockbusters, some of them may actually just take expensive diseases and make them more expensive. And so we have to be able to justify adding that to our formularies. And so that is the work that QRSMA is doing. So I'm going to end on that. And thank you guys very much.
So if we could have our first panel come up, that would be great. Dr. Kissel. Dr. Murray. Dr. Klinger. Dr. Kerr. Are we missing some? I have to find. You know, I can't use a PC. Here it is. So,
Hello?
let me just get this back. You know, I can't do this. Sorry, I always use a Mac, so I can never figure out how to use a Dell. Anyway, HP. So I would like to introduce the panel. We have, of course, Annie Kennedy from PPMD, Douglas Kerr from Shire, John Kissel, who is the chair of the Department of Neurology at The Ohio State University, Catherine Klinger, who is the senior vice president at Genzyme Corporation, and Tom Murray, who is president emeritus at the Hastings Center. And we will take questions from the audience. We also collected a number of questions from people online. So while Kenneth is going around getting questions, maybe we could start with this. And so I just probably like to start off and ask Doug and Kathy, who have worked in pharmaceutical companies and biotech world for many years, how a sponsor decides it's time to file an NDA, when they have enough data, and how these negotiations go with the FDA.
You know, I mean, I think the important point is that the people developing the drug from within the pharmaceutical company are passionately committed to getting this approved. It's their whole lives for many, many years. They want to get it approved for the community, for their company. It's what they've worked toward. So, you know, I think the incentives are aligned here between the community and the company. everybody wants to see this approved. But, you know, Annie talked about it. It's not just approved. It's approved in a way that as broad a population of SMA patients can get it. Because, you know, if you try to go too early, you may actually run the risk that it would get approved for only a small segment of the population, and that's not what we want. Or you may run the risk that it's approved, but insurers won't pay for it, or it's not available in certain markets. So I think there's a bunch of pieces that go into play. Everybody wants to push it. In a rare community, everybody wants this approved. But you want to get, I mean, the goal for, I think, everybody is get it approved as quickly as possible for the broadest segment of the population that it's appropriate for. When to actually do that is tough. Nobody knows for sure. And that's where Cure SMA and advocates working with regulators influences that. And that's where we have the opportunity to shape that. And I think we as an SMA community have been shaping that.
So I agree with everything Doug said. And there's no one who wants to go slow. There's no motivation to go slow. There's no incentive to go slow. There's a little bit of color to kind of when you decide to file for each individual program and each individual therapeutic, because there are preliminary discussions with the agency, with the FDA. There's pre-IND calls, sometimes pre-IND calls that give you direction as to what they are going to be looking for when you come forward. Now, the ringer to that is they're not bound by that. Those are conversations. They're not, contracts, so to speak. And so, but it gives you the flavor of the way the agency is thinking. And so part of what influences when you come forward is knowing what they are likely to be looking for, although, if my crystal ball were that good, I would be out buying lottery tickets. But knowing that, when do you think you have the body of data and evidence that is going to be sufficient to allow you to be successful going forward? Because going forward and failing in the process, it's very hard to regroup and come back, even if you think you know what you need to do differently. You're kind of tainted a little bit. It's not that there's officially one bite at the apple, but functionally, it gets harder.
Kenneth, you have a question back there?
Hi. I am wondering almost exactly on some of the points you've already mentioned. I'm a type 3 parent. My daughter is a participant in the HONEST trial. Definitely is working for her. We entered in phase 2. But among the type 3 parents in this room, there's a great deal of concern about the fact that type 3 patients were not included in that trial and what that will mean for the approval of the drug for the type 3 community. And I'm wondering how and why that decision was made and what both the company and Cure SMA are doing to ensure that the approval will be broader than the trial.
That might be a call for your next panel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the next panel, may discuss that a bit. But I mean, I think everybody wants to include as broad a patient population as you can. The problem is if you do a particular trial with different types of SMA, you don't have the same endpoints and the variability is much greater. And the risk that you run is that by doing too broad of a population up front, you actually fail on all fronts, and that doesn't do the community any favor. Now, getting all of the patients maybe in separate trials as quickly as possible is something we all want to do. You can talk to the next panel about the specifics.
And I want to piggyback onto that, what Doug said. And some of you have heard me say this about 6 months ago in my clinic. I had one of the most disturbingly touching moments I've had, I think, in my 35 years in this career when a type 3 woman who was probably in her 40s looked at me and said, "You have totally failed the SMA community." And I said, and she wasn't talking about, Cure SMA, she was talking about John Kissel. "You have totally failed the SMA community because you told me that you were going to try to spearhead trials in adults, and we've had very little up to this point." It was very crushing. But I think reflects the same frustration that the questioner had. And so I agree 100% with what Doug said, is that, when you do a study, you want to maximize, you want to get the sweet spot for showing a benefit. But to kind of put a positive spin on this, and I'm going to tee the ball up for Kathy, which is that, and I tell all my patients this, is that I always say one of the nice things about SMA, there's nothing nice about it, but one of the things from a therapy point of view, there are types of muscular dystrophy for which the same gene defect can have these wildly different phenotypes and look completely different from patient to patient, and there clearly is something else going on in terms of therapy. In SMA, the basic pathophysiology, the basic thing that gets from the gene defect to the weakness is the same for all types of patients. So if something's good for the goose, it should be good for the gander. And I think, as I tell all my type 2 and 3 patients with this, when this question comes up, is if you look at the example of Lumazyme in Pompe disease, which I'll let Kathy comment on, it was sort of I always say a hop, skip, and a jump from it being approved in children to being approved in the adult population.
Yeah, it's true, but we did have to do another trial. So the original 2 trials on which the product was approved under the name of Myozyme were done in infantile onset patients, classical type 1s, very similar to what you see in SMA with type 1, 2, and 3. And the primary endpoint was survival. And the agency said that's very nice and we'll approve this, for the very striking, it's very, very powerful clinical benefit, transformative for these babies. But survival isn't the problem in type 3 patients, for example, in the adult patients. And you have to show us that this same drug, despite the fact that they have mutations in the same disease, it's a continuum just like SMA, you have to show us that you are going to have an impact on endpoints that are of clinical relevance to that patient population. Not just mechanistic relevance, not molecular relevance, not biochemical relevance, but clinical relevance. The good thing, as John pointed out, is we were able to do that very quickly, and so the delay was very short. But we were required to do an additional trial.
So there are ways that once the drug is approved, you can do post-marketing studies to broaden the label, and I think that Pompe's disease is a good example of how that was done.
And there were significant post-marketing commitments. And again, because it was a very quick follow-on, only 1 trial was required. It was not a long, laborious follow-on. It felt like eternity to me, which is really all I can remember about it. I honestly can't give you the exact time. I'll look it up and find out for you, but I wouldn't want to give you the wrong answer.
We have a question from Dr. Crawford.
Yeah, so actually I would like to know more about what efforts we can do to try to help the FDA lower the bar for that process of expanding the label. I know we can do everything to try to do it, but what sorts of pressures do we think that we could try to do from a regulatory and legislative thing to say, once you have plausibility in one group, can we have a lower bar to be able to extend it to another group?
Well, so we've been actually working very hard on that. And that's part of why I pulled out the guidance. So, and I can pull out what we actually wrote when our Duchenne guidance and what they came back with. I think part of the issue, though, isn't even just working through what FDA will accept on the label, it's what payers will accept. And so we actually have frankly, it's a bigger issue, is that if we don't create the evidence, then we're not going to get reimbursement and coverage. And so I think FDA actually went pretty far in our guidance to say that they would actually accept fairly broad labeling. We were actually very pleased when they came back with that. Now, the proof will be in the pudding when we, knock on wood, perhaps have an approval and we see what that label looks like based on, and if it matches up with the guidance. But then we have an access question.
And Tom, I'll give you another example, like in lysosomal storage diseases, which is another set of rare pediatric severe genetic disorders. A company that I work for now, Shire, did a series of clinical studies developing an enzyme replacement. And when we went to the FDA said, you didn't study it in patients from 0 to 5 years of age. And we said, we know. They said, okay, well, we're going to approve it across the entire age range. But you have to go back and do that study. But we're not going to limit it to a certain age range now. So that was the type of discussion that we had with them up front. But it was really important that the FDA had some flexibility in saying the label, meaning the access, isn't going to be strictly what you studied in the clinical trial. It will be broader than that, but you're going to have some commitments, although it'll be available to patients now. That type of thing, I think, is what the SMA community will want and should try for.
Hi, I'm back here. I'm a mother of a type 2 little girl, and I don't know if it's appropriate for this panel or the next one, but could any of you elaborate or discuss drugs in the rare disease category, trials that were stopped early because they showed a clear benefit, and if they were stopped early, what was their approval process, if they even went on to approval, and how that worked?
I mean, there are examples both ways, yes. There are examples where studies in rare diseases have been stopped early because of benefit, and they have gone on to approval. There are examples where they've been stopped early, and that has essentially terminated the program, in that you ended the study too early, and you didn't have sufficient data, and you can't really kind of go back and recreate that wheel. So it is hard to know, but certainly I think everybody is going to look as quickly as you can in a trial. You know, one thing you have to know is that the clinical trials are protected in such a way that the company is not looking at the data. They can't see it because that would influence how the study is conducted. And if bias is introduced by peaking, then that study essentially can't serve for approval. And nobody wants that. So if you mess up the clinical trial and peek at the data up front, what the regulators will say is, you know what, that influenced how people thought about the drug, how the study was conducted. So you can't peak except when you've pre-specified it. And you only want to do that very, very carefully. So there's only so many options in which you can try to look early. Really what you do is you set up the study in an optimal way such that if it meets its endpoint, everybody would say, yes, this is an approvable drug.
I was in attendance at the Washington, D.C. SMA. We had a bunch of people from FDA, of course, close proximity to where we were. And everyone on the desk said, this SMA drug will be put on a fast-track basis. And they also alluded that the drug approval will take about 12 months instead of the 18 to 24 months time frame. Is that still on the cards? The second question I have is, there has been a lot of trials that have taken place, i.e. ICIS Pharmaceuticals. Can you give us or shed some light as far as where we stand as far as the data and the results are concerned?
Well, I think for the specific questions on drug products, you'll have to wait till the next panel when the drug company representatives are up there.
I can't speak to what the FDA said to you about the SMA product, but again, going back to the Duchenne case study, I was a part of meetings with the FDA, and I have to say, first of all, we're very grateful to CDER and the neurology division and everyone at FDA for all the work that they've done and how much attention they've given our community. But for years, we've been interacting with them around several products, but especially a product that's probably is the parallel has been Sarepta's product, eteplirsen. And some of those same people have said probably, I wasn't in your meeting, but probably similar things to us about eteplirsen. But at the end of the day, those things didn't happen. And here we are, the eteplirsen trial has gone on for 5 years, and then after the company submitted, this has been probably one of the longest product reviews, and I'm not criticizing, because if it yields an approval, we are grateful. But we have learned that we had to give the company, and we pushed heavily on the FDA. We had petitions, and we pushed heavily on the company. We had petitions. But at the end of the day, we've had to give the company and the FDA the space to do what they needed to do to get it done. And it's a very small trial. The pivotal trial is 12 patients in that trial. Now there have been other trials, and thank goodness the company opened other arms of the study, because now those arms of the study, that data is now going into the FDA's consideration, which we're very, again, grateful for. And if it weren't for the PDUFA reauthorization, that wouldn't be happening. But that was, the PDUFA reauthorization was 5 years ago and happened since this trial started in our first meeting with the FDA, where they sat across the table, and it was Janet Woodcock and her team that sat across, and it was Billy Dunn's predecessor, Rusty Katz. I mean, the personnel's even turned over in the time they told us these things. So I'm just saying that to say that the FDA is wonderful, and it's because they care deeply, and I think they do get it, and they want to help us. But at the end of the day, it's what happens in those discussions, what we've learned between the company and the FDA and those meeting minutes that are really going to move the needle. What we can do as a patient community is, if we are seeing that there are real obstacles and roadblocks, we legislatively and through policy get through them and move them. And we can do that in partnership with those stakeholders, or write guidance, and work with the FDA to get that done. There is a lot we can do. It does not at all mean sit on the sidelines, but it does mean that there were some things said to us that we walked out of there and said, all right, let's get this done. That didn't happen.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, because there are many things you can do. You're absolutely right. But the idea that you have to give the space that the FDA requires is also critical, because at these advisory committee meetings, frequently the first question that the FDA poses to the committee is this the result of an adequate and well-controlled study? That's a catchphrase in the FDA world. And if for any reason they answer no, there are then legislated downstream consequences of that. And so any pressure that compromises the trial design in such a way that the answer may now come back, oh, because of an interim peak, oh, because you changed your secondary or composite endpoint, oh, you did, whatever, make it up, that now the study would be considered to not be well-controlled, et cetera. That's the worst thing that you want, because it will be an incredible struggle after that. So the place to push is on removing the roadblocks, right? So that the agreement on what that well-controlled, what that really means is there. Because the FDA is not lying. They're not saying, oh, no, we're going to tell you we'll fast track and we won't. It's just that then they've got these other layers of granularity that you say, oh, but, right? So that's really, let the trial, whatever the FDA says has to happen in the trial design, let that go forward, but advocate to remove the roadblocks to begin with.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that and quote my colleague Doug on the committee, that when we had a couple of conference calls to plan for this this session, and one of Doug's mantras as we were talking was, we are at such a unique and exciting position in the community. The worst thing we could do is screw it up now, and that's kind of what the other people have been saying, is you don't want to screw it up at this point, and one false step could really screw it up.
We have a question over here.
Yes, I'm from Korea, and I know no one wants to go fast, but no one wants to go slow. But there is something we can be quick, or we cannot be quick. Like there are 2 ongoing clinical trials in Korea, and one is CHERISH, and one is in there. Unlike the CHERISH study, which has already 3 enrolled patients, in their study there is only 1 enrolled patient, and there were also 2 potential candidates for the trial, but they were failed because when they had the diagnosis, doctor said, your children are eligible to the study. See you next month. For the type 1 patient, disease progression is very early. But after the 1 month, a patient had pulmonary events, and saturation got under 95. So I'm wondering, is that the problem of the protocol, or just the physicians are missing? It is severe, but I think they are missing something.
I mean, I'll take a stab at that one. There's a lot of questions about that anecdote. I will say that even at Nationwide Children's in Ohio State, that there is a certain fatalism among, I think, pediatrician and non-neuromuscular neurologists who don't know the field well, who don't understand the urgency. And yeah, we've seen that where people wait. I'm sorry. Oh, you? Okay. Did you want to make a comment? Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's a problem, that people don't recognize the urgency of getting people in as soon as they can and referring to clinical trials. And just in all, in my 35 years of doing clinical trials, if I had $1 for every time a patient would say to me, my doctor never told me about this trial, or even worse, my doctor told me about this trial but said it was a waste of time, so don't go there. That they're just wasting their time. It's never going to work. And I think that's a prevailing attitude.
In fact,
because of prior.
Holly PA at the research meeting and at the family poster session last night had a study where she showed, one of the ones that I alluded to on clinical trial participation, where 66% of the participants said that their physician never talked to them about clinical research. And so you're right, there are some physicians who don't do a good job of that. And I think that was something at Cure SMA we saw and said, we really want to try to do something about that. And that's one of our goals through our industry consortium, to gain awareness about SMA in the more general healthcare field and try to change that.
But it's not just the urgency of physicians once the diagnosis of SMA has been made, it is the diagnostic journey itself takes far too long. And Cure SMA and many of the companies in this industry consortium have actually been looking at that and ways to diminish this diagnostic journey such that it doesn't take 3, 4, 6, or in some cases 18 months to get to a diagnosis. Because if you can get to that diagnosis of SMA earlier, you're much more likely to be able to refer it into a clinical trial when you can get there and meet all the inclusion criteria.
Hi, I'm Katie. I have a son, Caden. He has type 2. He's 2 years old. Quick question. I know Dr. Kissel. Actually, I have 2 questions, if that's okay. Just one? Okay, sorry. I had the pleasure of getting to meet with Dr. Janet Woodcock and Billy Dunn and their CEDAR team a couple of months ago. And one thing that Billy Dunn said to us when we met with him was that SMA is really the model disease for flexibility in the FDA because of the strong natural history that we have. And I've heard conflicting things with that. And also my question is, in regards to trial design, I've just never really seen much flexibility. Like all the trial designs look very standard. So I guess I'm just confused as to why Janet Woodcock and Billy Dunn would say that they want to promote flexibility for SMA, and yet we're not really seeing it on the trial design end.
So others jump in, but I just want to remind you, when they say flexibility, they mean that adequate single well-controlled trial, right? Like that, they mean that they would consider approving a drug based on one trial, not having multiple trials come through. So it means something different to us. So when Billy Dunn talks to me about flexibility, I think, great, that means a lot of other things to me than it means to somebody from the FDA. The other thing is Duchenne also has been told that we are the perfect model based on our natural history. And no, and I don't mean that, I'm not trying to be flip. I mean, we have amazing natural history data. We have this global natural history database. We thought we had all this great data, and then we've gotten into product reviews, and guess what? We actually, our Sarepta trial is a natural history match control instead of a placebo control, and the FDA had told them apparently that they could do that, and that's been an issue with the review. And what we've had to do is create a consortia around a progression model, and John Porter's here who tried to pull that together. And so I just say that to say that, first of all, I think engaging with the FDA is incredibly important, because what you're doing is getting SMA in front of them as a priority. And you want the FDA every day to wake up and say, well, I want the FDA every day to wake up and say, what's happening in the Duchenne community and what's happening in the SMA community. You want that to be their biggest problems of the day, is to get up and find out what our communities are doing, what industry's doing, and when products are coming into them. That's what you really, of all the diseases, you want them to worry about us. That's what you want to have happen. And so interacting with them, doing it in the ways that we're doing it are really terrific. But I do think it's really important that we not take everything they say to the bank. I mean, Billy Dunn made very public statements at the advisory committee meeting to the Duchenne community, and then days later had that meeting with your families that contradicted a lot of what he said to our Duchenne community on the record. And so I think I think CEDAR really cares and they're trying to do the right thing. I think we have to follow guidance. I think that's what we take to the bank, are the guidances that FDA is putting out.
Yeah, I just was going to say the same thing, that like it or not, the FDA lives and dies by randomized controlled trials. Did you send around the article from the New England Journal? Yeah, so there was a nice article in the New England Journal that I think is going to be posted, or that's available just a couple months ago, on randomized controlled trials and how it became the sort of coin of the realm, and how it's still the coin of the realm, but the limitations and advantages to it. So Jerry Mendel this morning, when he presented the gene therapy data, an update on the gene therapy data, was asked from the floor that question: is there natural history controls, going to be allowed? Is this going to be the next phase going to be a placebo-controlled trial? And in sort of research speak, he basically said it will be what it will be, and we're waiting for the FDA and working with them about that issue.
And the thing about gene therapy, the thing about that is that's going to be a different review division at the FDA. That's CBER, not CDER. And so those are different players for us to get to know. Those are different people to get to know SMA and to start to understand what the urgency is in the community, what the patient preferences and benefit risks in the community are. And so that becomes a whole different kind of engagement, right? That's a different group of characters to know and understand.
So I think we'll take one more question and then switch to the other panel.
Hello, my name is Amanda Camp. I'm mother to a diagnosed type 1, and I'm not really sure if I have a question or just maybe a thought that I wanted to put out there to kind of, maybe have something considered and maybe have some answer to. But when we look at the drug pipeline, I think it can be very exciting and hopeful. There's so much that is on the cusp of happening for our community, and I know, especially for the parents who have been in the SMA world for a long time, it's amazing to see all the changes. I just wondered, like with your presentation, Annie, with the ecosystem, and then the thought of how strict some of the pre-exclusions have been for trials, as we move forward, some of these drugs in the pipelines are really more probably treatments, not so much cures. And are we prepared as a community, as different boards, to look at trials that use combined treatments, and also, change regulatory processes so that we can utilize the drugs in the most beneficial way, especially if we don't have a cure now, but could have, improved benefit with combined treatments.
I'll just say, at the research meeting, we had an entire session devoted on Thursday morning to this exact topic, and the fact that we may have to use combination or cocktail therapies to have treatments for every type and stage of SMA. And we brought in people from other communities that have successfully done that, or discussed examples of things from the oncology or other places, CF, that have done that. So that's something that's, I think, on the forefront of everyone's mind in the SMA community as sort of the next frontier.
And that session was great because it really taught some of the researchers what does it take to do combination therapy, because it probably is going to be very important. Your question is right on. And so we talked about kind of, well, how do you make sure that the two safety problems don't make things actually worse? And what do you have to do to allow those combination therapies to actually get into patients? And then we talked about really what we know about SMA from a molecular level and cellular level to say, well, what's rational? Like, where you would kind of want drugs to intersect at different parts of the pathway so that they can optimally stop or allow even regeneration in the disease. So it was a very good discussion. I think it opened up everybody's thoughts about combination therapy. It's not trivial because you do have to make sure the toxicities don't augment each other, but it's possible. And I think lots of communities are thinking about and moving toward that.
And just one last point on that. There's two things. There's true combination therapy, which was, for example, what was being talked about with cystic fibrosis, where contemporaneously you are bringing forward two compounds that you believe will work well together to solve a problem. And then there's what I call polypharmacy, where you're treating different aspects of the disease with different therapies, which is mostly what the practice of medicine is in many other diseases. And so if you're taking what's standard of care and already approved, then adding another drug on top of that, you still have to look for drug-drug interactions, things of that nature, but it's a different path, and it's kind of one that's standard in medicine. And I think the exciting kind of part we're all thinking about right now is bringing forward rationally selected combinations that, like Doug was talking about, kind of contemporaneously. But don't forget that things get layered on standard of care as well. So just because something becomes accepted as standard of care doesn't mean people aren't going to try to come forward with other drugs that would be, then become part of that armamentarium.
Tom, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, in the past, I've served on an FDA advisory committee in the CBER division, the Center for Biologics. So I have a lot of respect for what went on there, and I just feel like, although it's always been implicit, we haven't explicitly made an essential point, which is the point of doing these very carefully designed studies. Yes, in the end, it's to get FDA approval, but what we're really looking for is proof that we can all believe that this actually helps our children, right? That it is safe and that it is beneficial, significantly beneficial. So that's ultimately what we're about. The FDA approval comes after that, but it all really hangs on being able to show with confidence that this really is helping. And that's why we're here.
So I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and expertise. So we're now going to turn to a panel of representatives from different drug companies that have SMA drugs in clinical development. They've given me a slide describing their program, and I'm going to use it to quickly introduce each of them so we can focus most of the time on the questions. And once I do that, I'm going to give them a few minutes to correct or amend anything I say incorrectly. So we first have from Roche, Thomas Blattler, and he is, did I pronounce your name?
That was perfect.
Okay, and he is representing Roche on their alexamine program, and many of you most know that this was it's a neuroprotective compound, an oral compound that was studied in a placebo-controlled double-blind clinical trial in people with type 2 and non-ambulatory type 3, age 3 to 25. Right now, the Roche is in active consultation with the FDA and EMA to discuss the adequacy of that trial and to establish the risk-benefit framework. And from those discussions, they've come to the conclusion that they will conduct a phase 3 study, another placebo-controlled clinical trial for the drug. They've opened an open-label study called OLEOS, and it's an open-label extension study for all the patients that were in the first trial. And I think that's the bottom line. Thomas, do you want to just say a few comments?
No, you summarized that well. I think it really also again speaks to the necessity of having a very robust study to support a benefit risk that regulators consider sufficient to establish the benefit risk. We spoke with both health authorities, so both the FDA and EMA, and they felt that we were not quite there yet. And based on that, we decided that we wanted to really make sure that the drug becomes available to patients, and that's why we're now looking to run another phase 3 study.
Next, we have Larry Charnas from Novartis. I'm sorry, and he and he's working. Something I don't know. Yep, no, I have secret connections. No, LMI 0707 and a bunch of X2201, but I think you just call it LMI 07. And they've treated 13 patients with this. The longest to date is 14 months. It's the maximum tolerated dose study has been reached, and the adverse events have been generally mild, and the drug has been well tolerated. They've identified some new target organs for following toxicity in a chronic dog tox study. Since this has happened, the patients will remain on study with a dose modification, and there'll be additional safety measures put in to monitor those patients on the drug. There have been 2 pulmonary deaths due to the disease, because the patients, I failed to say, are type 1 infants. However, no patients have withdrawn from the study, and there are still, I think, 11 patients, or is it 10 patients on drug? Larry, you'll have to clarify that. The main primary, they've seen increases in the CHOP intend, and maintenance of independence on both feeding and ventilation have been observed. But they have further recruitment in the trial has been temporarily paused due to these findings in the chronic dog study. However, as I said, the patients who are on drug are staying on drug with additional safety measures being put in place. Larry, do you have anything to add to that?
Two things. So there are 11 patients on study right now, and you forgot a no in number 2. Maximum tolerated dose is the maximum dose that individuals who receive a drug can tolerate without unacceptable adverse events. And it is a mark of safety in a clinical finding. There have been no maximal tolerated dose has been found. So if you look at the trial objectives on any of the clinical trial websites, the goal of the trial is to find an MTD, and we have not found an MTD,
Yes,
which means
I'm sorry about that. I don't know how that went away. I'll fix that before we post these slides.
Yeah, okay, please. Thank you.
Oh, in fact, I can fix
Or I may be working for Roche.
Oops. Okay, that might have been a mistake. Anyway, just go to the next slide. What did I do? Kenneth, can you come help me?
You know, I'm going to have to send this back through legal if you do this, so.
No.
So while that's going on, I found a size 5 little gray kid. I assume it belongs to somebody here, so feel free to come and claim it.
So we also have Eugene Schneider and Wilden Farwell from Ionis and Biogen for their drug nusinersen. And they are in a collaboration together to develop and potentially commercialize this investigational compound. It's designed to alter the splicing of the SMN2 gene to make full production of the protein. They've received both orphan drug status and fast track designation. They're currently conducting 2 phase 3 studies, as you know, in deer and infants, and cherish and children. And Biogen is also conducting 2 additional phase 2 studies, Nurture, which is a phase 2 study in pre-symptomatic infants, and Embrace, which is a phase 2 study designed to collect additional data on a small subset of patients with infantile or childhood onset who don't meet either the age or criteria for Endear and Cherish. And so they have a very robust clinical development program with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ongoing clinical trials, as you can see on the slide. And either of you want to?
No, not really. You nailed it. We need to work on nusinersen, but other than that, that was great.
We have Richard Porter from Roche talking about RG7916. It is an investigational medicine that was developed by Roche, PTC, and the SMA Foundation. It's a orally taken drug that's designed to correct SMN2 splicing and increase the production of the protein. They now have a phase 1 study in healthy volunteers to assess safety, and studies in people with SMA with types 1 to 3 is expected to start by the end of 2016. They had a study called Moonfish going on for another splicing corrector called RG7800, and this drug, as many of you heard, is on clinical hold, and the patients who participated in Moonfish may be potentially eligible to join the new study, open label study with RG7916.
Nothing to add, thank you.
And we have Stacy Rudnicki. Rudnicki, I'm not very bad pronouncing things. And their drug CK2127107, a selective activator of fast skeletal muscle in the troponin complex for the treatment of SMA. This is the one drug up here that is not, well, we have two drugs up here that are not SMN enhancers. We have the neuroprotectant compound and this drug, which is a muscle enhancer, function enhancer through this particular mechanism of affecting the fast skeletal muscle troponin complex. They have a phase 2 trial ongoing with patients 12 years of age and older in confirmed types of type 2, 3, and 4 SMA. There are 72 patients who will be enrolled in this trial with a randomization of 2 to 1 from drug to placebo group. This trial will last 8 weeks with 4 weeks of follow-up, and it is a dose escalation study with 2 doses. A cohort 1 will have a dose of 100 mg BID, and then cohort 2, a higher dose of 450 mg BID if they meet the criteria to move up to that higher dose level, and to test the safety and efficacy of their drug.
I'll just clarify, it's 150 milligrams twice a day for cohort 1. You said 100, that's okay. And it'll be 2 sequential cohorts, so there won't be overlaps in the patients participating in those cohorts. We have 7 sites up and running currently. There will be more to come. You can find new ones that come on board as they get activated on the clinicaltrials.org website. Our current sites that are enrolling patients are Stanford, Utah, Washington University in St. Louis, Ohio State, Kansas, Johns Hopkins, and Boston Children's.
And finally, we have Doug Sproul on AVXS101, which is a gene therapy for SMA. They have a fully enrolled phase 1 study. It's an open label study in type 1 infants. They're receiving the drug, they receive the drug, since you receive it one time, intravenously. Pilot studies, the pivotal studies of the intravenously administered drug will be planned in the US and in the EU in 2017, and a study of intrathecal administration to allow them to go into other types of SMA, namely here type 2 patients is planned for the second half of 2016. Doug, do you want to?
I think that's good enough for now. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for all of us.
So now, I just wanted to quickly go through those introductions so that we could focus on your questions. So, questions from the audience?
Hi, my name's Lori, and my husband and my sister-in-law are type 4. We hear a lot about 1, 2, and 3, of course, understandable. What's going on in their realm of anything, that's coming up to help with their weakness, that, anything that goes on with it? Because it seems like so much is more towards the 1, 2, and 3s.
Could you hear the question?
No.
Kenneth, can you repeat the question? We couldn't hear it. So
I think it's just looking for opportunities in type 4 as well in any of the trials.
Stacy, do you want to?
Sure. So we are enrolling patients with types 2, 3, and 4. So we realize that that's a particularly underrepresented patient population in SMA trials. And we start with ages 12 and go on up to whatever age.
Yeah, and I can just add to that, kind of build upon what was said. There was a lot of work that was described this morning in the research conference to better understand just the disease itself and the longevity of that disease and to help us think about how to better design trials and conduct trials in those populations. But I think all of us that are conducting trials in the infant populations and the childhood populations will be looking at those results to better understand how they may apply to additional populations. And so it will be very important for us to see these data to help inform whatever those next steps might be.
Hi, I have a question for Ionis Biogen in regarding your drug. Once, not now, but are there any plans to play around with dose and dosing frequency? Like kids are on 12 milligrams now. Are there plans to go up to 15, 18, higher? What about dosing interval? The infants get at Q4 months, children again at Q6. I know there's questions too about puberty, particularly because there's intense development during that time as well. Are there plans to play around with dose and frequency?
Great question. I can take a stab and then let Wilden add. Generally speaking, we are just beginning to scratch the surface in understanding this drug and what it can do and what it does. Typically, a lot of these questions are answered in what's called phase 4, post-approval. That's where dose optimization types of studies are done oftentimes, because approval really is just the beginning in terms of exposure of much larger populations. But typically, dose exploration is done, relatively minimal dose exploration, finding an effective and safe dose and testing it and trying to get approval. So that's kind of a long way of saying before approval, probably not, but post-approval, a lot of these studies done for pretty much all the drugs.
I would just add to that to say that the dose that we currently have in the studies are the doses that we have the best evidence and data for to date. And so the goal is to really see in the controlled clinical trials, are those doses efficacious? A component of the clinical trials that isn't talked about enough, but is very important, is the PK. So many participants of clinical trials, they often have blood or other samples collected to do what's called PK. And what that is it's really measuring the level of the drug in those specimens in the blood or in the CSF. And that data will then be helpful to us at the end of the study to be able to determine, is the level of that drug related to the results that we see, either from a safety perspective or from an efficacy perspective. So do we see that there is a maximum level of exposure that is associated with safety findings? Do we see that there is a level of exposure that's related to efficacy? That will help us then determine, are additional studies necessary, or how to design those additional studies. But right now, the question is, can we show safety and efficacy in the doses that we have under development? And that's the first question that we're trying to answer.
Hi, I was wondering if you could explain more about the drug that protects instead of replaces. I don't remember what it's called, but it protects the muscles or something like that.
You may refer to Olesoxim. That's a drug, oral drug, that is a solution that targets mitochondria And cells like the motor neurons, but maybe also the muscles, are under a lot of stress. And by targeting and improving the mitochondria that are the powerhouses of the cells, we believe that we can protect cells and help patients maintain their function. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Marisol. We are from Chile. And we would like to know if do you have any special criteria to accept international patients to a trial? If do you have any international patients at the moment?
So for the nusinersen program, we certainly have trials ongoing in a number of countries around the world. For any trial, it really comes down to what is allowed at the individual site and what is allowed per the protocol. So there are some countries where international participants aren't allowed. There are some institutions that do not allow international participants. So it really comes down to the specific study and to the specific site to determine whether those types of patients from outside a particular country might be included. For us at Biogen, the one study that's currently accepting patients is Nurture. Nurture is available to be have international travel. Again, it comes down to the individual site, whether that is permissible or not. But there are opportunities for that depending upon the local investigator and his or her particular site.
I think for all of these trials, they're in different countries.
I mean, typically we will run studies globally, and that will include North America, Europe, but also other regions, including Latin America from that perspective, or Asia. Again, under the premises you eloquently laid out.
Can I just fine tuning this question? What is generally motivation to go broader instead of just one country?
So the question was, what is our motivation to go broader globally instead of focusing on one country, for example, US? I think it is important to assess a drug and its effect, its benefit risk in globally. It is important to gather data in different ethnicities and also to understand how a drug may work in different regions where we have different standard of cares. It also, of course, is a challenge because you need to make sure that you still have a study setting that allows us to have a robust signal detection, which means we are looking to have a fairly homogeneous patient population and conditions. So it is actually addressing, it is a bit of a dilemma, but it's also very important to understand that your drug works globally.
Maybe I could just add to that and to say certain countries, certain health authorities would actually require us, in order to get approval in their countries, to have a minimum number of patients to ensure that it works in patients of different genetic, ethnic backgrounds.
Yeah, hello. My son Matteo is 10 months, type 2. My question is for Doug. I heard some very good things about albuterol syrup, and I'd like to know if that would be an exclusion.
So I don't know if the question made sense to the audience. I'm presuming it does, and the question is related to albuterol syrup, liquid albuterol, which has been used and explored for many years as something that has an anabolic effect and may help patients with SMA. and other muscle diseases for that matter. At this point, speaking of our development program, we are putting together and aiming for pivotal studies in the United States and in Europe, looking at an IV administration for children with SMA type 1. We're also in the process of putting together studies looking at intrathecal administration for older and larger children. The question of exclusion criteria I can't really get into, but it is what you raise is a major challenge that I think affects all of the industry partners, which is how do you design a study that appropriately is as broad as possible and includes as broad a swath of the population, a broad swath of the management, without creating excessive variance that prevents us from being able to interpret the results. So at this point, I can't. The quick answer is I can't really say because we haven't really determined a lot of that. In general, I think that albuterol is something that is being used as a therapy. I don't know that it's necessarily effective, but it's something that I think is potentially challenging for enrollment in trials in general. I don't know if you guys have anything from your particular studies that you're thinking about as far as liquid albuterol and whether that's something that impacts enrollment.
It's certainly something that could complicate interpretation. You alluded to that, and that's an important point, that you need to balance that need for a clear result and being able not to confuse the interpretation of the results. And regulatory authorities are very concerned about having some alternative explanations for the effects they see, both on the efficacy side and the safety side. So it's always a balancing act when you design protocols, oftentimes requiring discussions with regulators. I could tell you from Ionis's experience, we have not included drugs that are used off-label for treatment of SMA for that reason.
Hi, my daughter has type 3 and she's had spinal fusion, so it's been almost impossible to get her into any type of a study because of the spinal fusion. Is this something that you guys consider? Are you thinking about it? What about the patients that actually had the spinal fusion? It's just, it just seems like it's not something that's being considered, and I'm sure you've got many, many patients that have actually needed the spinal fusion. And what do you do? Are you taking any steps to look into that situation?
So, we have a number of patients in the program that have had surgeries and have had hardware inserted, and we are following those patients to see just how the drug works, to see if it, if they have a different safety profile or if they have a different efficacy profile that will then inform the overall knowledge about the program. I think it's very important for folks to remember that, clinical trials are designed to answer a scientific question, but that doesn't mean that the label that informs treatment is going to be exactly like the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trials that were conducted. So it's always a negotiation with the regulatory agencies, and it's something that the data from the trials informs, but it's many times the case that the data from the trials support a broader indication than was what studied. It's also the case that the data from the trials can inform a narrower population than what was studied. It is something that you have to look at the data to then be able to have that conversation with the regulatory agencies.
So maybe just to add to that, one of the things that we are planning to do, and we're still in discussions and negotiations in the design of our studies going forward, because we're earlier for the Roche splicing modifier, is that we would be opening an open label safety extension study with a view to then study a broader patient population that wouldn't then be eligible to partake in the, the pivotal studies. So that's how we would look to broaden that population.
I think it's getting again at this point of when we run a study. I think it's the concern we have with people who have those few spines is that we may not, with our current instruments, be able to show a benefit as well as in those who don't have that. So what we then have to weigh against each other is the likelihood of success of being able to demonstrate that the drug works versus being inclusive. And currently we think the most important priority to us is to bring drugs to patients as quickly as possible, and that's where this comes from. But we are currently very much thinking about this situation.
In our study, we don't exclude patients with scoliosis surgery, and we take type 3s, so it's something perhaps to consider. You can talk to your physician about that.
Next question.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kavita Krishnaswamy from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm using the beam from Suitable Technologies, and I have my friend Krista Cliver helping me today, so thanks for the opportunity to be at the conference. I'm very happy to join all of you remotely, at least. So I have a question for the panel, please. So can adults with SMA type 2, especially adults above 30, benefit from any of these treatments and medications? And specifically, I've had a spinal fusion, and many adults like myself have had it. So what medications or treatments can be accessed now and in the future? And what are pharmaceutical companies, can they tell me more about what they're doing for adults with SMA type 2 and those that have had spinal fusion? Thank you.
I think you raise a very important question is, so how can you get access to treatment? I think we all think about means how to support treatment also in adults, patients, and that's why, for example, some of us then run open label studies in adults just to also make sure that the drug and show that the drug is safe. The problem that most of us face is that adult patients often have very slow progression when it comes to loss of muscle strength. And that's what our instruments today are focusing on. I think it will be important, and I think we're all thinking about also assessing other aspects that are important to you. That's, for example, also why Cure SMA, together with us, is running their qualitative interviews to understand better what is your problem, how can we best measure that problem. We first need the tools in our hands to really understand how to show that the drug works also in adults. So what we're currently doing is really looking at ways, mostly indirect ways, to establish that the drug is likely to work in adults, and then have the arguments later with health authorities, and in particular also with payers. And that's what we're currently also doing. We are talking to all those stakeholders that ultimately make sure that you are important to actually provide that we can provide access to you. Any other?
So it's an interesting question, and I think I'm probably going to show that I spent way too much time with lawyers by quibbling about words, but I'm going to do it. And Rich, as you can see, the chairman of the board, Richard, is smiling because he and I have had this discussion about therapeutic misconception. There are no approved treatments for any form of spinal muscular atrophy, and we hope that that changes, but right now the answer is there are none. So if one enrolls in a clinical trial that is a human experiment, the informed consent form is required to say that this is experimental therapy. And when people ask for treatments, it sometimes is confused that you will get benefit from a treatment, and that has not been proven. I think we heard about that. So I understand the desire. We all want it to be done as quickly as possible, and we wish it were present now. But there is a risk when the wrong word is used that people assume that by enrolling in a trial and getting involved that there will be benefit. And until you've proven that, you actually don't know that. That's why it's an experiment. I'll also speak for the people on the panel in that we understand that this is a little bit of word parsing, and we appreciate the contribution that every participant in a clinical trial makes. It is an enormous investment of time and emotional energy and resources and a huge burden on the families, and we all deeply appreciate that. But I think we need to get the language straight. So thank you.
Hi.
I think we all can only echo what you just said, which is really, this is not a means to get treatment. It's actually means to participate in an experiment that ultimately should bring treatments to you.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Kostachenko. I'm the mom of an 11-year-old with type 3A SMA, to be very specific. First, I just want to say thank you to all of you and to the last panel as well. We're grateful for everything you're doing. So I have a specific question that I asked earlier of the last panel, which I'm sure some of you heard, particularly for Mr. Farwell, Mr. Schneider. So we made a really scary decision to enter phase 2 of your trial, which I'm really glad we made because type 3 was not in phase 3 of your trial. And this isn't a question of frustration. This is really a question of fear and concern and wanting to know what hope type 3 children, adults with SMA, with type 4 are going to have at the point of approval. And so I want to know specifically what you're going to be asking, if you can make that answer right now. Are you going to be asking for approval for those populations? And what are you doing to prepare to get the FDA to say yes? And if they don't, what's your plan?
That's a good question. No, first of all, thank you and your family for participating in clinical trials. It is a difficult decision and one that's not taken lightly, and you know, we certainly recognize that it is a sacrifice that many in this room and many in the community have taken, and we very much appreciate that effort. You know, what we have said, and is still the case, is that we will be searching for the broadest indication possible. But that depends upon the data, and that very much depends upon the results from the ongoing studies and how the data from those studies come out. What's the safety profile? What's the efficacy profile? How do we best interpret that? Given those results, we will absolutely go to regulatory agencies in the US and elsewhere and ask for the broadest indication that we believe is supported by that data. You know, we have had ongoing conversations with regulatory agencies, and part of that is to help them understand SMA, help them understand just what does it mean to have type 1, type 2, and even type 3A to make sure that they understand those distinctions. And there is an education that has to occur. And so, you know, it is a process that we've gone through. I am telling you that we will ask for the broadest indication that the data supports, and that's really where we are today. So as you know, the type 3 population is in the phase 2 studies. All of the studies are part of the application. So as I think one of the previous speakers said, every single piece of data that has been collected on nusinersen will be part of that application. And so, it will all be part of the package that's considered and evaluated.
Nothing much to add, just to remind you that those studies are not forgotten. Even the phase 1 studies matter a lot, because when you submit an application, you tell a story of a drug from its inception in animal experiments, even before that in cells, to the end of phase 3. So all of that package, all of that data are included, and they mean something. And the more compelling your story is, the easier it is to argue for a fuller label. And we believe that we are in a good position to do that.
Hi, my name's Celia Vandervelden. I have a daughter who just turned 5 with type 1, and this is for Ionis. There was a recent teleconference, or actually I don't know if it's so recent now. I heard the claim that if you were to have started a separate trial for, let's say, type 1 symptomatic that did not meet the criteria cut off, that, so in my mind, that's actually the worst of the worst that need it the most because they face a daily life and death threat, that the FDA would look to that data in their determination and that it may mess up the trial. Whereas we've actually had the FDA come forward and say that they have never judged a trial as such, particularly looking at like orphan drug status, and that, so when they do compassionate use or expanded access, and that they would not do so now. So what reason do you have left for not allowing the worst of the cases a Hail Mary when they had or have no other choice but death? And then to go with that, we've also had Janet Woodcock recently tell us that if she saw any improvement, that would be sufficient enough for drug approval. So who's willing to hold her accountable? Who's willing to come forward and change the way things are?
Thanks for a very tough question. I'm going to try to answer it the best I can. So the key to what you just said is shown in effect, because again, just to remind everyone, probably unnecessarily, that this is still an investigational drug, which means it hasn't been proven yet. So to show an effect, whatever that means, requires a very specific population-specific protocol, and we try to do that balancing the needs of a large population and versus the time to show that effect, which is best done in a very small group of patients that all are very similar to one another. And that's the toughest balance to find in drug development. So if the patients fall outside of the protocol that we believe is optimal to show that effect fastest, that is unfortunately the population that is not going to be eligible for that study. And that's, again, the decision that is not taken lightly. The protocol design takes months, if not years, of discussions with SMA physicians, with patient communities. The saddest cases were the babies who were just barely outside of the eligibility criteria, and all of those babies took hours of painful and agonizing decision making between the investigators and the sponsor. And I can tell you as a physician, and as a parent, it's just heartbreaking to not be able to find a way to include that child. But again, if you look out for the better of the drug in the community, you have to be able to say no. You have to be able to abide by the protocol, because again, the last thing we want is for the protocol to be lost in all of these decisions being made on a kind of flexible matter. At the end of the day, we will not have a successful trial. We will not have an answer for the regulators, and we will be blaming ourselves for doing that. So I don't have a good answer for you. Unfortunately, at the time, the protocol for type 1s was designed with our best judgment on what is prudent to show an effect, to show a benefit very clearly, and to judge that, to balance it with the risks that were taken. Because again, it's not just the effect that you see, but it's also the negative, the safety assessments that are being made from the same protocol, because it ultimately is going to come back to, is the benefit worth the risk that we're seeing?
Maybe I can just add to that. You know, once the trials are complete and we have data and we are able to see that the drug is safe and effective, you know, Biogen and Ionis are committed to opening an expanded access program to a population that is supported by that data. And so, you know, I think it is very unfortunate that more patients weren't able to qualify for our study. I am rooting for all the companies on this stage to have trials, more drugs to be available for patients to participate. I think it's, you know, it's impossible that any one drug is going to work for every population and for every patient. So, you know, as a community, we need more clinical trials, and we need more options for participation in that. But as far as, you know, nusinersen goes, once we see the data, and if that data is positive, then, you know, we will be opening an expanded access program.
My name's JC Marino, and I also have a type 3A child with SMA. My daughter's been in the study since.
The question you were asking me.
No,
it's going to be about general about the program.
Yeah.
Specific, okay.
About her, back to her question, I'm kind of like, my stomach dropped out of me when she said that. Why aren't we doing, are we doing studies then with the type 3 still, so that when this is approved, they get treated? Back to the FDA question. Is there studies?
The ongoing studies still include patients with type 3, absolutely. And those phase 2 studies are ongoing.
Hi, I just have a sort of a little bit more of a lighthearted question for the two of you, Dr. Farwell and Dr. Schneider. Who came up with the name nusinersen, and what happened to the SMNRX delineation?
You know what? That's a great question. I don't know who the individual was. One of these days, I hope they make themselves known. You know, I wish there was a little rhyme and reason to it. I think there's, you know, you know, all of the antisense drugs have the same ending to the words. So nusinersen is the same as eteplirsen and drisapersen and some of these others. So I don't know. Maybe, do you know who that is?
I haven't a clue, but my hope is that the trade name would be much sexier. But that's, it was definitely not the people who came up with Ionis, I can tell you that much.
So actually, if you really want to know the answer, this is the INN name, and I can't remember what the middle is, something international something nomenclature. And there's a stem, and then there's the part you put in front of it, and there's a competitive process that companies usually get together and put a variety of reasons that they think about it. And then there's an adjudication committee that actually decides if it's taken, if it sounds too much like something else, to avoid confusion. So there actually is a very rational approach on how these names come forward. And it is so that in the future, that names are distinct enough so they don't get confused as things become generic, and it will go forward. In the meantime, we're quite a ways away from worried about. It's sort of like like Burgess or something.
I changed that.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists today for taking the time to come and talk with us. And